Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, come on. We're at a nerd convention. I know y'all know how to be loud and rowdy. Good afternoon. Wow. We've gone back to like the library and teacher days. So, I have notes in front of me. This is why I'm not being rude. I just need my notes because I'm old and I can't remember anything. But this is not having racism in your campaign or settings. Hopefully you're in the right room. This is the only panel room, so if you didn't mean to come here, this is your one chance to leave right now before I make an example of you if you try to escape the room. Obviously, if you have small animals or small humans, I will not do that to you. So, I've done this panel a couple times now at PAX Unplugged. It's my first chance to do this here at OrcaCon. And before we get into the meat of the panel, I would like everyone to introduce themselves. And I'm just going to start with the most salty thing we can think of. What is the most egregious example of racism as a RPG player or writer that you've experienced? DC, you first.
I can't legally say.
All right, so pre being legally bound, what can you talk about?
I'm kidding. Honestly, it's...
Oh, also, everyone, please give your pronouns.
Oh yeah, I'm they, them, repping non-binary, what's up? I think just growing up, playing with a particular group, the people who like I played with all the time, just combined amount, let me just put it that way. Or like you want to play the game, you want to have a good time, but you still got to deal with that stuff. My name is DC. I am a narrative designer at Wizards of the Coast on Dungeons & Dragons. I also do a lot of community work in the independent space. I run the Babylon Equity Project, which is going to happen again this year. Rock and roll.
Oh geez. I was trying to think. In game, there was one player in one group who, because my character had dark skin, insisted on referring to him as Darky in game, and that went over about as well as you think it did. No.
Are they still among us?
I haven't talked to them for long. I don't know where they are anymore. Okay. I can't say. Anyways, and like in like materials, there's just so much all over the place. That'd be a separate panel and just be me talking till I was hoarse. But my name is Graeme Barber, he, him, and I am the writer, managing director for POCgamer.com, which is a blog that I started after 4th edition came out for D&D because of what happened to Chult and all the other not white parts of the realms. I've been involved in creative writing, freelance writing, narrative design, and world building.
My name is Brian Cortijo. My pronouns are he, him. I am a freelance game writer, in particular in the Dungeons & Dragons type space, Dungeons & Dragons Pathfinder, Blue Rose. My most egregious example was when I was, let's say 14, one of the kids in the group that we were playing decided to flip through every book that he had in order to prove to another player that they could not play a character who looked African in heritage. Now, of course, that wasn't made any better by the fact that there weren't any characters in the books that they were flipping through to point to say, you can play a character who looks African. But it was a really early reminder that what goes in the books matters to people. And the people take some of the stuff really seriously, and they use it not to welcome, but to exclude. And so that stuck with me now for 25 years. That was we didn't play with that kid anymore, by the way. But it was a pretty stark slap, pretty early on.
I'm Misha B, she, her. I blog at I can talk. BlackGirlGameworks.com. I'm also a third of New Agenda Publishing, which is producing the upcoming Arun. And I'm a member of one of the curators for More Seats at the Table, which works to highlight women and non-binary and other gender marginalized people in gaming and their games and their Kickstarters. And so if you have stuff to throw at us, please do. As for the most egregious, it would probably be Dragon Con in the mid-90s. I hadn't played D&D before. I'd been playing RPGs for a while. Hadn't played D&D before, so I'm flipping through a book. I'm like, okay, this character kind of looks like my grandma, kind of looks like Storm. Sounds like a good character to play, right? Awesome. Sit down, make the character. GM doesn't say anything about. It's like, are you sure? It's like, yeah, why not? My character walks into the tavern where the rest of the players are, where the rest of the characters are, and one of the other characters slits her throat, and the GM lets them. Because I was playing a drow, and because the person kind of looked like my mom or my grandma, there must have been something wrong and evil about her. Great.
On that happy note, my name's Tanya. I mean, look, I have many feelings about the drow, but it is not late enough the evening, and I do not have enough libation to have that conversation right now. My name's Tanya. I'm your moderator. I'm known as Cypher everywhere, and I've written for Green Ronin and Paizo, and I'm currently co-developing with Joe Carricker the RPG based on N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth series. So that will be out at some point next year. And I have so many egregious moments, but a lot of them have to do basically with girls can't do this. Because I would always, when I first started playing D&D, I always wanted to be like a warrior. I never wanted to be a healer. I wanted to be a rogue or a paladin or something. And of course, as girls can't do that, and especially not black girls can't do that. And I don't know, it's one of those things where it's like, I feel like I've almost blocked a lot of the terrible things out just for self-preservation. But one thing that makes me think about it is so I'm on Rivals of Waterdeep, that's the other thing that I do. It's an actual play show, which is a Wizards of the Coast official show on their Twitch channel. And we got profiled in New York Times. And a lot of us talk about our characters, like we all intentionally made our characters brown and black. And there's not a white character among us or a white player. And one of our players talked about how he very intentionally made his character a black queer elf. And someone immediately went, so you're a drow? He's like, but I'm brown. And the fact that people still automatically go to a black elf must mean drow is something that makes me like turn various shades of red. So, before we get into various things, and I know DC has an exercise that they would like us to do, just about the panel very quickly. So Tabletop is growing. I mean, everything's going through Renaissance. I can walk into Target and go buy an Essentials kit, which, you know, as a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, I never would have seen that before, never thought I'd see it. But racism is still very prevalent in our hobby. We are in Seattle, and there's a reason people say Seattle's so white. There's a reason that I don't play games at conventions. I've gone to Gen Con 4 times. I've yet to play a game at Gen Con. And it's not assuming everyone's racist, it's assuming people have inherent bias. Because we are soaked in this inherent bias from day one, and what people tell us, the messages we get, the things that we see. And also it doesn't help that a majority of the RPG shows, podcasts, etc. feature basically the same bearded white looking dude. And it's what we get treated to, and we don't see people like ourselves, other than like Tales from the Mists, Plot Hunters, Rivals of Waterdeep, and Awadius, who does Trace Albus, and what Graeme and everyone else does. You don't get to see a lot of people of color just getting to play the game. And it is why I want to have this conversation. And it's going to be a very frank and very salty conversation. This is not a handhold you, this is not a pat you on the head and tell you you're a good ally or a good white person. This is also not to yell at you and say that you must be a horrible racist. If you sit here and hear that I called you a racist, I suggest you take a moment and self-evaluate, because that is not what I'm telling you. Trust me, I've had this happen both in person and on Twitter, so this is a valid concern. And so I want to talk about why this is a bad mechanic, a bad thing to have, and why you shouldn't have it, especially if you're not someone who actually has ever experienced racism, because you cannot accurately depict it if you choose to do so. And I'm sorry, if you can believe in a Scottish-sounding dwarf and an elf and dragons, you can understand that brown people could exist in fantasy worlds. So, let's talk about it. Who wants to go first? Why should we talk about this?
I got something to say. I have a little exercise that I want you to do real quick. But before we do it, I want to explain something and why I want you to do this exercise. A lot of people are, a lot of white people generally are born into a world where, you know, you are born, this is your time period, and you experience things, and you don't think about how things have progressed from the past to how things are now, and so you take a lot of things for granted and think that, oh, because things appear to be okay to me now, things must be okay. But when it comes to racism and then how we end up projecting that and using that in places, you can only understand how bad it really is if you understand that this country was not only founded on racism, but has continued to do extremely racist, violent, prejudiced things up to today. And in order to do that, you actually have to look and see. So I'm picking things only within the last 100 years. I would like you to look up some things on Google. Click the first thing. Don't worry, it's a good resource. I would like you to look up Move, M-O-V-E, 1984. If you have a chance later, watch the YouTube video. I would like you to look up the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. I would like you to look up redlining, and especially since we are here in Seattle, look up redlining and Portland. Look up those things, and from what you learn there, you will begin to understand that look up Juneteenth as well, but you will begin to understand that even up to today, even up to the point where some of us were born, the foundations of a fair and respectable life for people of color does not exist yet. It just doesn't. That being said, let's get into the fantasy. Once you read some of those things and understand some of those things, you'll begin to understand why when someone says, I don't want racism in my fantasy, that's just 100 years. We could keep going back and back and back, and how much that is our history, pain, and struggle from people who immigrated here, from people who were slaves brought here. All that stuff lines up to this massive history of pain and struggle, and someone goes, I want to use this as a toy in my game. I don't understand what it is. I don't really care about it. It's just something that I see so often and is used as a way for games to have a story. Who knows why? Don't care about that either. I'm just going to use it as a toy. And if you don't understand what you're using, you think that you are simply wielding a pen when you are taking a flamethrower and pointing it at a lot of people who just want to play the game as well.
Anyone else before we move on? I mean, we have an hour 15, so we're not rushing through this.
I think what DC says is really important about not gamifying people's pain. If you don't come from a background where, for example, you're descended from people who were enslaved, slavery is a really casual thing that you can throw around because it's not part of your personal history. But if you're playing with someone who's African American at your table, that context changes immediately. Now, that's not to say if you don't have someone African American at your table that it's okay to play with that. You're making something, an element of something that's supposed to be casual and fun, but really is painful and traumatic and the cause of generational and intergenerational harm for people that we still feel the legacy of today. It happens that half of my family is Jewish, and in order to drive this home, I whenever I'm having this conversation, I say, well, what if you had a game about the Holocaust? Would that be okay? And the answer, of course, is no. It's not okay. There are people who, there are still people who survived the Holocaust living in our society right now. Just because it was farther in the past, just because there aren't people alive who remember it, doesn't make it okay to make that an element of your game. Because there are real people who truly suffered, and there are people who are still suffering the impacts of that trauma now.
I'm actually going to caveat that just a little, because I have seen really well done, respectful games about experiencing the experiences that happened during the Holocaust, but they were made by Jewish people. So if it is something that is in your background and you're doing it respectfully and you're doing it, like Steal Away Jordan is the best game that you will ever read or experience or play that is at its core about slavery in the American South. It was written by a black woman, and it's an amazing, but the purpose of it is not, the intention behind it is not, oh, slavery is fun, slavery was great. It was, this is what the experience was like for slaves. And so it's more about immersing yourself rather than having fun. And with that caveat, I would say, yes, there are, I hesitate to use the word game. I think probably experience might be a better thing, or guided experience possibly. Where, like I said, the intention is not necessarily for fun, not for enjoyment, but it is a way of teaching and is a way of learning about an experience that is not your own. Like Rosenstrasse is an excellent example. It's a game by Jessica Hammer, who is the child of Holocaust survivors. It's about the Aryan women who had Jewish husbands in World War II and how they had to fight to keep their husbands from going to the camps. And it's extremely well thoughtfully crafted. And I would put it on that same level as Steal Away Jordan, of taking a painful, horrible experience that was in your family's background and making it a centerpiece as a way of teaching empathy and teaching about an experience going forward.
That actually dovetails very nicely into our next point about bringing people of color and other marginalized identities, and specific to this, people of color to the table and black folks. And, listening to you talk about this game, I'm glad that it's well done, but me personally, I would never want to play this game. So I think there's room to talk about, for some people it could be cathartic. They may want to play it, it may be a fantastic game, but I get to live this 24/7. I don't want to live this at the table as well, but that's me. I can't speak for anybody else. Despite what people may tell you, I cannot speak for all other black folks. We do not literally all know each other. It may seem that way in RPGs, but we actually don't, I'm glad to say. But I want to talk about this because the question I get the most, and I know DC has gotten it a lot on Twitter, so has Graeme. Actually, all of us probably have, of, I can't find people of color, I can't find black people, and I'm writing this thing, or where someone has written their magnum opus of RPGs, and then they want you to be the speaker for all black people, or all people of color, or all queer folks, fill in the blank, and tell them, no, this isn't terribly racist, and then you read it and you're like, oh, Jesus. I need whiskey to read this, and maybe an exorcism. So I want to talk about that, both the questioning the purpose of race and other social constructs in the games we play, because Graeme did a great world building workshop this morning, and we talked about this as well, but bringing us in on the ground floor versus the, I've written this thing, please read it and tell me I'm not a horrible racist, which is what happens a lot in the things that I wind up doing. So who wants to start? Don't all talk at once, or I'll just keep talking.
Fair enough. So one of the big things that I found, like when I started the PC Gamer blog, I started it because of the sad puppies and rabid puppies movements in the Nebula Awards a few years ago.
Can you explain what that is?
What it was is a group of reactionary and frankly racist writers were upset with the direction that science fiction was going. They didn't like that it was progressive. They didn't like that there was all these not white people showing up and writing and being characters in the books and all that sort of thing. And so they tried to organize an active, basically an abuse of the Nebula system in order to get the books that they felt should be put forward into the positions to be voted for, and then to organize voting blocks for them. Fortunately, they failed, which is a good thing. But that and some of the events in Dungeons and Dragons at the time with 4th edition got me onto this, and well, a lot of it comes from the origins of the hobby, which aren't great. A lot of the key material referenced in like the back of the Player's Handbook in DMG is got all sorts of issues, like H.P. Lovecraft, crazy racist. Robert E. Howard. I love Conan the Barbarian, crazy racist. Like and it's through all of that sort of thing and it filters out into a lot of the narratives, archetypes, and concepts that go into games. And it falls into that unthinking bias that was discussed at the very beginning of this panel. You know, people look at it like, well, this is just how it is. This is how we're going to write it. This is normal. And as a result, you find people pick up a book, they're like, oh, sweet, like, this looks good. They'll open it up, get hit with a bunch of stuff they deal with day to day, and then they'll just close it, shelve it, and walk away. Or if they participate with it and engage in the community with it, the issue they run into then is they'll run into people who have absorbed this, accepted it as normal, and respond as vitriolically as possible and with as much like violence as possible as they can online to anything questioning it.
Yeah, although one request to not use crazy in that context, please.
Say again?
A request to not use crazy in that context.
Fair. And it just turns into a downward spiral that drives out any sort of development the medium could have. I mean, the year is 2020, and we're still using mixed race archetypes from the Jim Crow South to define half orcs and half elves. You know, and people are still looking at half elves and saying, hey, like, they're split between two different peoples. That makes them natural diplomats. Also, I'll give them a magical power that lets them manipulate people to think that they like them. That'll work out great. And these things still come up. So that's why we're here on this panel right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do a large amount of sensitivity consulting and editing for RPGs. And the one of the more recent ones I've done was for Fate of Cthulhu, and that was, I was like, they let me write what I wanted to say about H.P. Lovecraft, which was, if you don't believe he was racist, look up the name of his cat. It'll take 5 minutes, not even. And then you'll figure out pretty quickly, yeah, no, he was pretty racist even for his time. Despite having a Jewish wife, he was completely anti-Semitic. Every story he's ever written is pretty much a exercise in xenophobia to the utmost extreme. And for some reason, he's still idolized and lionized, which just baffles me, but that's a different question. And so I do find that often we keep turning back to these same themes because we haven't found, not so much that we haven't found anything better, it's that they're so ingrained and so repeated and so the norm that nobody can see something better even when it comes along and smacks them in the face. So, like, there have been hundreds of books written since the time of Lovecraft and since the time of Tolkien and since that have been worlds better. I mean, you could take anything by Octavia Butler and it's like, hey, can we make this world the basis of a game instead? But nobody's done that for some reason but no, we have D&D already and we already have a world building, and why can't we just try something different?
A lot of it too is that the worlds that you play in are structured specifically so that you're better than other people from the beginning. And whether you realize it or not, that's valuable to you in a power fantasy. At any point, if you are a guy, if you are white, you are put in a position where you are better than everybody else from the beginning. In fantasy settings, it's set so that all of these different races have problems, etc., yada yada, but every version of the perfect race, usually elves or whatever, that's the gift for humans to turn into their perfect form or whatever. And sometimes that's even just the idealistic praise of false Eastern Buddhists with heavy, heavy quotations, because we're nowhere close, idea of what people can be, and those people are always both white, where white are in light, like the contrast of light and dark is so prevalent. So even when coming down to going, hey, I can't find any people of color who want to play with me in my game. It's like, well, are you playing a game where a person of color is equal to you? And that's in the fantasy. Is their fantasy inside the game that you want to play, or is your fantasy inside that game? Inside that fantasy, is it just oh, well, there's the one-to-one for me, and it's really bad. And your one-to-one is, yay, I'm the hero, and I get to go down the hero's journey. Where's my lightsaber? That's why people don't want to play. If you're not thinking of these things and you don't see these things a lot of the time because, like Misha said, it is extremely ingrained. It is the soil which you can walk on, but really that soil's just like full of blood. And it's something that if you don't inspect, like you can just choose not to, but that's exactly how we get the stuff that we have now. We have way too many fantasies. All of the popular ones degrade general marginalized people, especially women of color, and anybody who is not male generally. I have non-binary feelings.
Legit. But since DC kind of went there, I'm going to actually skip ahead because the next slide people talked about without even having to be prompted, so this is why I like paneling with my friends. But I want to spend a little time on the lie of build it and they will come, since you brought that up. And this idea that if I just tell people my shop, my table, my stream is welcoming, and why aren't the brown people flocking to me? Where are they? Because I've had people reach out to me and say, well, my convention is very white and it's very old, and we'd like to get more people of color show we're welcoming. And I'm like, well, what have you done? Usually that's the end of the email correspondence. Or I get the, well, we put up a flyer on a table at a convention that probably no people of color were actually at. Because here's the thing, and I'm gonna take moderator privilege and soapbox just a little. This is like live Twitter, if you follow me. You can say, till you turn blue in the face, that you are welcoming. You can say that you're an ally, and I have many feelings about the word ally. And depending on how this panel goes, I may talk about those feelings, but they're not positive. If I or anyone on this panel goes to your con and sees mostly white faces, if I see no one involved in running the convention as a person of color, if I never see you bring guests or anyone who is in the field that is there to talk about their craft, not just, oh, I'm brown and it's terrible. I want to go to a con and see DC talk about circle theory. I want to hear Graeme talk about world building and Forgotten Realms and all the other stuff. I want to see both Brian and Misha talk about their craft, not just the, oh, RPGs are terrible about being brown, because that feels like the only time people want to hear from us. And that's not all we can talk about. I love world building. I'm a huge nerd. I want to get immersed in these worlds. But so many people are just surprised when they basically lay out the diversity trap. And I don't mean trap in the terrible transphobic way. I mean they litter the ground with, look, we invited one brown person for the first time in our 50-year history of this convention. Why aren't you flocking to us? Because I can't spend $2,000 to go to your convention. You have made it literally impossible for me to attend. Because just for some transparency, it costs me just as much to go to Gen Con as it costs me to go to PAX West. I live in Chicago. I can drive to Indianapolis. I can take a bus there and it still costs me just as much. So there's access cutoff, there's availability cutoff, but no one thinks about that. They don't make it possible for people to attend, you know. And granted, I'm biased because I work with the convention, but there's a scholarship to get people here. There are people working to get folks to conventions and giving them access, but the average person with a game shop that just wants to see more diversity, you have to open the door and also back up what you say. You can put a sign on the door that everyone's welcome, but if you don't kick a racist out, if someone gets harassed, if a woman is touched inappropriately or spoken to inappropriately and you don't actually do anything, it means nothing. And it's the same empty allyship that everyone wants a cookie for. So I know other people have thoughts about the live build it and they will come. Otherwise, I'll just start yelling and that will be the rest of the panel.
Hey, Brooks.
No, you just go.
All right. What Tanya said is absolutely true. It's not enough to simply say, yes, we're diverse, yes, we're accepting, yes, we're safe. There has to be outreach. If there's no outreach, if there's no effort to actually contact people, get to know them, bring them in, and bring them in at different levels as well, then you're not actually going to achieve anything. I mean, it's like opening a restaurant out in the middle of nowhere and then complaining that nobody shows up to eat, even though you have the best food. If you haven't advertised, if you haven't let people know what's going on, and if you haven't integrated those people into your systems, they're not just going to magically appear and be like, oh, thanks for doing this. This is amazing. It's so nice. I'll just sit down. No, that's not how it works. Not how it's ever worked. And if you look at any conventions, like the amount of effort they put into advertising and reaching out and stuff like that, and it's phenomenal. But if you're going to be moving forward and trying to say that you're an open and diverse place and a safe place, you need to reach out to those marginalized communities, which means you may need to learn a different language. You may need to learn a different way to communicate and interact with them in order to bring them in, because otherwise, the suspicion meter immediately starts pinging. And if it just keeps on going, people will just back away because nobody has the time, emotional energy, or finances to go to something, get burned, and then come home. It's a waste of time, effort, and resources.
Yeah, we all have a limited number of vacation days that we can spend in a year. And do you really want to spend it going to a place where you're going to be othered and looked at askance the whole time? So a lot of times things like, hey, if I go and look at your website and the only black and brown faces I see are on one page, and like all the candid shots of your convention are all white, I'm gonna look a little funny at that. I'm gonna like, maybe not. But also, like the other imagery that you're using, are you advertising with covers that are, sexually kind of explicit? Are you advertising games that are by people that are known to be transphobic, racist, sexist? Are you advertising, is your acceptance policy on what games are going to be played for, are you talking about content warnings in your game descriptions? There are things that are easy to put into place and say, hey, if you're going to run a game, we need to know what the content's going to be, what age group range is it for, what exactly you're going to do. So like there was an example last year where it was sprung on a group of players in the middle of the game that they were going to just, oh, you wake up and you're naked. It's like, wait, what? And this was not a game that anybody expected this to happen. So it was like, why would you just spring that on people? And so having policies in place that would say, okay, if somebody does that, are they actually going to take care of it? Is the con set up to have safety professionals, not necessarily professionals, but a safety committee? Is somebody going to actually come and say, okay, that is not acceptable, you have to leave now? And if you say that you're going to do those things, you actually then have to follow through with it. If you tell me, if I complain, you will take care of it, and then I complain and you don't take care of it, I will tell everybody I know that you didn't take care of it, and so will everybody else, and that is not exactly the look that you want.
To bring it back to the gaming space, like how to get people to play your game. I had a conversation with a publisher a few years ago, I mentioned this in the earlier panel, who was complaining that not enough people of color were playing in their game. And I said, well, what are you doing to get that game into the communities that you want to see playing the game? Do you have your game in local libraries? Do you have your game in local after-school programs? Because if you want younger players that are younger players of color, there are access problems. There are issues with getting games into the hands of people that don't have disposable income. Gaming is not a cheap hobby. And the response was, oh well, we send copies of our core rulebook to libraries all the time, and that's marketing overhead. That's built into your budget. I said, well, you've got an organized play apparatus and you've got a starter set. Why are you not sending those to libraries and having your organized play apparatus run games for people who are interested in the game? Because you have to, if you're saying that your game is for everybody, if you're saying that your game is a welcoming space, is a safe space, then saying, well, we don't want to go into those neighborhoods and play that game with people, you're not fulfilling your message. What you're saying is, this game is for people that can already afford it. This game is for people that have already bought it. And it becomes problematic because you don't want to do that. the company was willing to say that this is what they want to do, but they weren't willing to do what was necessary to fulfill that promise. And, I don't talk to that company anymore, but I gave some honest advice. And when I was a kid, the favorite books for me to take out from the library were the Lone Wolf books, those choose your own adventure type books. I love those books, and I was reading those books even before I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I was 9 when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. So that was my gateway drug, as it were. And I was at the library a lot. Poor kids are at the library a lot, and poor kids are disproportionately persons of color. And so if you want to talk about communities of color and getting people into gaming and making gaming more welcoming for people of color, libraries are a great place to start. But I don't see any companies doing that. None, not even at the top of the industry. I'd like to see more of that. But I think that people talk a good game, but when it comes time to putting feet on the ground and doing the work, I agree that allyship is really empty. It doesn't happen. You don't see the work happening, at least not where I live. And I'm in New York City, so if it's not happening in New York City, where is it happening?
And I think you have to do more than just public libraries. You have to do school libraries. And if you really want the easiest way to target communities of color, send a copy to every school named after MLK, named after, who else? Rosa Parks. Any school named after a civil rights leader, I guarantee you is going to be more than 50% black, just because that's how it goes. You never see MLK High School in the white neighborhood. It's always in the black neighborhood. So just a tip, if you're looking to place to send, that's a good place to start.
I actually wanted to mention a good example of a convention that has brought in a lot of people of color and has done the work for years to get it to the point where that could happen, Big Bad Con, because I was working with them on the Babylon Equity Project. But the reason that project even ended up happening was because the people who were at that convention have been consistently questioning themselves at the end of that convention on how they can do better. They would bring in more people of color, they would bring in more women in positions of power, they brought in more disabled people, and they continued to ask, what are we doing that is making you uncomfortable? How can we support you more? How can we really make this a place where you feel safe, protected, cared for, and you can just go play the game? And the amount of people of color who were there 2 years ago was fairly small, but the people the people of color who had been there more than once, or even just once, were having a blast. It became a place where it was like, oh wow, this is actually cool. I had met a black woman there where we said hello to each other and then went to the side and we're like, has it been cool? Because that's a thing we do all the time. Is it safe? Have you had anything? I got your bag. And she was like, no, it's great, it's weird. It's a common thing. It's weird when it's good. And they had done so much work in order for it to be good that the reason that the Babylon Equity Project, I started a program that raised $26,000 to get 30 people of color to Big Bad Con last year. And the thing about that is that I told the organizer, I'm going to get these 30 people of color there, but so many more are going to come because we are showing them that it is safe. And that's the way that you get people in, is that you have to be a person, you have to be an organization that continuously always is on point and following up on what you say, because there are so many people who they say that they're doing good, they say that they're doing good, and they hit a limit, and that's the limit of where they will go. They will not be too progressive. They won't defend. It's like that GIF that was like, racism's okay, but I stop at animal cruelty. Like, that happens a lot. And so finding those places, it takes a lot of work and a lot of years for people to build up to get that trust. But then when we show up in big numbers because it's one of the few places where we're safe, where we can have a good time, and where when we see people of all different backgrounds, we know we're not gonna have any problems.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so glad that we did the POC meetup this year. And next year, we're already plotting for it to be bigger and better. So the few brown people between here and Portland, please come back. Look, I come here too often. I don't see a lot of folks like me. I can say that. And what I want to talk about too is the importance of representation and who we're seeing at the table. Because again, I can list 4 shows out of all the tabletop shows we see on Twitch, on Mixer, that are all a majority people of color. That is far too low of a number. And again, it's about access. Because it costs money to start streaming, especially if you want to get to streaming RPGs. And minor plug, I'm talking about this tomorrow with some other folks who stream as well. But think about it. For RPG streaming, at least you need decent internet, you need your books, you need access to at least digital things. If you're at a physical table, you need somewhere to meet every week. And gaming, like we've said, is not a cheap hobby. Even if you're just doing one system, if you need everything, that's a few $100s. If I want to run out and get everything D&D made, let's say, it's probably about $1,000 worth of books if I wanted to have literally everything. That's not even the super fancy editions. That's just literally everything. Because with Rivals of Waterdeep, and what's, I guess, funny but not really funny, is that the point of the show was to show that everyone could play D&D. It wasn't, look at us, we have brown people playing D&D, and aren't we progressive? But the side effect of it is more people are seeing themselves in the hobby finally. Because I stepped away from tabletop altogether for several years. Because I didn't see anyone like me, I wasn't encountering anyone like me. I kept getting the people that thought, tee-hee, I'll put slavery in my game. Or you said your character's black, therefore they must be illiterate, or from the fantasy equivalent of the hood, whatever that would be. I don't know, like a back alley in Waterdeep, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the fantasy equivalent of the hood's supposed to be. Or people that go, well, if your character's black, then they must have XYZ background, the Pygmalion thing, etc. So that's why I think, not just what we talked about with showing up and doing the work, but getting people out in front. You know, seeing people like DC and Graeme and Misha and Brian was super important, because I've been in the gaming industry now for a while. And video games is bad, but tabletop is worse. I hate to tell you. I'm not sorry at all, because it's the truth. Go to Gen Con, go to PAX Unplugged, go to all these cons where you may find a bunch of black people and then we all just stick together because there's safety in numbers, and that's not a joke. If you have uncomfortable laughter, think about that. Because I'm not going in certain places by myself as a black person, especially with the way the world is right now. But I do want to make sure we have time for questions. We've got about 30 minutes. We're not going to have 30 minutes of Q&A, just so you know. And when I get to Q&A, you better have a question. I will tell you to go find it. If you can't find a question, then come back later or come back tomorrow. If you come back tomorrow, we'll be done with this panel and you'll be out of luck. So I want to talk quickly about, and I'm just checking my notes, because we talked a little bit about streaming. I want to talk, before we go to Q&A, is stereotypes. Because, you know, aside from racism and trying to interject it in a place that, frankly, for me in a fantasy setting and for many others doesn't belong, a lot of people think that stereotypes are appropriate, and that's where we get back into racism. And it's punching down. Why should you have stereotypes when there's so many more creative ways to have villains? Because a lot of people make their villains, oh, they're racist. It's an orc that hates elves, and that's their mode for doing whatever they do, and they're the big bad. And improvising on stereotypes isn't funny. It's not good comedy. So I want to talk about that and the power of inverting a stereotype or trope and what it takes to do that well, because not everybody can pull that off.
For me, there's my favorite inverted stereotype that has actually started to become more popular is like the big, strong, white barbarian woman, because there's this body shape thing that's such a problem. And there's so many times where, like, in my head, I just think it's Zarya all the time. I love Zarya from Overwatch, because there's a body type issue. And when it comes to women, you will very rarely see women who are big, beefy, trunky, people who are actually fat, people who have real body types. You don't see that usually in women, and same thing with age in women. You don't see old women, because every woman has to be super skinny and young and hot, right? And then on the other side, really effeminate, soft men, because a lot of the times we have the big tough guy who is not in touch with his feelings, and like it's Han Solo basically, who has one feeling per movie or whatever. And that's something that continues to, I mean, that's stuff we absorb, but we eat that up. That's all we do, we consume. And so it perpetuates these stories where people can't talk about their feelings. They have to try and be this big badass. The girl can't be strong and tough. She gotta be the healer, right? Like people can't. They're like, oh well, you're fat. You can't fight. And it's like, have you seen martial artists of all sizes, sword fighters of all sizes? Like people exist. We actually exist in the real world. It's really easy to put things into fantasy because you can just do it. And so those two in particular are my favorite. Little effeminate men, let's just put them everywhere. And then just old black badasses. Anna.
What's the guy from Tekken? The new dude, Leroy?
I just call him Leroy Jenkins. How could you not?
I mean, you ain't wrong.
Extremely good friend of mine, much smarter than I am, described to his students that humans are poorly programmed pattern recognition machines. And we are. Like when people say things, it irritates the hell out of me when people say things like stereotypes exist for a reason. They don't. The reason that stereotypes exist is because it's a mental shorthand that your brain can use to quickly identify and classify something and then place it in reference to you in a hierarchy or in the world or environment that you're in. That's the only reason that they exist for. They aren't indications of reality. They aren't indications of any sort of like real aspect of said group. It's simply a fast way for your brain to deal with a large amount of information. And unfortunately, that shorthand makes its way into a lot of games, where you'll see writers who will say up and down like, yeah, well, I'm progressive, I'm advanced, I'm doing all this stuff, and then you'll see their writing and they're using the same quick cues to bring people in to the game. Like for example, of my friends that I play role-playing games with, half of them came in with Dungeons and Dragons. The other half came in with other games. And 2 years ago, I tried to bring the group that came into other games into Dungeons and Dragons. They couldn't do it. The reason wasn't they couldn't understand the rules. It wasn't that they couldn't grasp the concepts. It was that all of the shorthand, the stereotypes, the tropes, the narratives, everything else like that, hit them so hard that they didn't want to play the game. Like they looked in, they're like, why? Like what he was reading the information for halfling. He's like, why does it want me to play a thief or a rogue? I'm like, well, it doesn't say that. He's like, no, but everything's pushing me that way. He's like, it's talks about stealth, talks about sneakiness, talks about all these things. They're trying to direct me to play this, and I want to play something else. And it was through the entire book. And for me, it was a real wake-up moment because I had been looking for shorthand and other things, and I hadn't been thinking about that as well. And that's another way that games try to direct things. And when I realized that and I looked back over a lot of other stuff that I'd read previously, it was like being hit by a truck. I was like, wow, there's a lot more problems here than I thought there was initially, because all of a sudden things stood out like, why are all the black people afraid of magic in a world that is literally drenched in magic, where you need magic to do anything? Why are the Asian coded groups all doing this one super specific type of magic, but for some reason nobody's figured out how to throw a fireball? This doesn't make sense. And it just, the narratives, the tropes, the stereotypes all just piled up one on top of another to make things just not great. And it's nice to see, you see some companies are addressing it now, and you see some of the stuff that people are working on is they're trying to break away from it, but it's incredibly difficult. And even myself, I'll read over stuff that I wrote when I was younger, and I'm just like,
Let's put that back on the shelf.
We all do that.
Yeah.
We all do that.
Into the furnace with heat.
yeah.
I find stereotypes in writing very lazy. Because what you do with the stereotype when you're writing is you're saying, I'm going to put this label on this character, and the reader can scan that label and get all the information that falls into that stereotype without me having to put it on the page. It's especially bad when someone uses racism as a code for being evil in a game. I actually wrote about this on the web a while ago. The reason it's so bad is because it implies to your reader that racism only exists in the very worst of people. That if your villains are racist, then regular people can't be racist, right? And it looks at racism as a character flaw instead of a systemic problem. Racism, of course, is a symptom of systems. It's not something that one person brings to the table and you beat the bad guy and the racism suddenly goes away. If only. It'd be nice. But it doesn't work that way. You know, racism is hard-coded, certainly into American society. And I find that when there's a lot of people also that confuse kind of species to species antipathies in fantasy games. You know, elves and dwarves don't like each other, so they must be racist against each other. Orcs and elves don't like each other, so they must be racist against each other. And so anything less than that kind of conflict, which grows out of history and grows out of the in-world cultures, isn't really racism. And then, you know, those behaviors in the real world, people kind of write those off. And, you know, fantasy gaming, for me, is a way to help explore some of the best and worst aspects of ourselves in a safe environment, well, safe-ish environment. But that doesn't mean that we should gleefully dive into the worst aspects of ourselves and show them to one another, that we should surrender to those baser instincts, because we cheapen the real world effects of the real world victims of those same flaws. So I find that in particular with racism, although there are other things that you could inject into your games that would be bad, in particular with racism, the idea that I'm allowed to hate this group because they look differently than I do. Or worse, I'm allowed to kill this group because they look differently than I do. I'm allowed to enslave this group because they look differently than I do. These people who are thinking, acting, loving people are suddenly not people because of some characteristic that they don't share with me, is not one of those things that's safe to experiment with in game. Because what you're doing, first of all, those characteristics may be shared by real people at your real table or in your real world. But also, I don't think that that's a safe place to delve into the human psyche. I think that the idea that we can safely explore our desires to harm other people based on what they look like doesn't exist. You know, that's a thing that we should stay as far away from as we can.
I think one of the things that I struggle the most with a lot of games is the concept of like evil races, that you can, you can tell this person is evil just because of the way they look. And people not interrogating that and thinking, wait, why are we bringing that concept in? It's like, this person looks different from me, therefore they must be evil, and not connecting with how that has been played out time after time after time in the real world. And so when you have even the suggestion that either everybody in this species, race, whatever category, heritage I think they're using in some games, is automatically evil, and is pretty much, that means you can kill them on sight, which also a little weird. But unless they're one of the good ones, or one of the special ones, or one of the, not like all the other blank, which if I ever hear that in relation to myself again, I will probably punch somebody. But it's a thing that a lot of times we've heard over and over and over again. It's like, I didn't mean you when I said that. Or frustrating, to say the least. And just to have that either model minority mentality or tokenism mentality, or for some reason it's okay to think of an entire group of people as, because they have a difference from the character you're playing or the person that you are, be okay to think of them all as automatically evil is just weird to me.
I'd actually like to build on that with the, I talked about it in the world building this morning, that was everything has a place and everything in its place, where you'll see someone, like they'll bring a bunch of fantasy races and species together, then mysteriously they're all doing the same jobs because they're just biologically suited to that. You know, like every half-orc is a bouncer, every dwarf is a smith, you know, every lizard man is a fisherman. That's like it doesn't seem initially like it's feeding into racism or those issues, but in reality it is, because you're simply switching the stereotypes and ideas from one thing and you're patterning them onto something else, and using the cover of fantasy to sort of act as the break between the two, and it doesn't hold up well.
It's real world. You place that over the real world, you know exactly who goes where.
Yep.
I ain't gotta say any of them. You know exactly who goes where. Tolkien did it. What's her name? J.K. Rowling. Bam. Just people know. They know exactly where to put all the fantasy areas. People are like, oh, I don't know what analog this is for.
Yeah,
Yes, you do.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
You might not want to admit it, but you do.
Yeah, so I don't know if it was recorded actually, but a couple years ago at PAX Dev, I actually did a panel with Wes Schneider, who now also works at Watts, he used to work at Paizo, about interrogating those inspirations, of looking at things like Tolkien and the 50 pages of the feast and the walking in the grass and the other shit. But also, why are orcs evil? Why are they... And every time I say this, I always get someone who's like, I had no idea that orcs are a stand-in for black people. And that nervous laughter is going to catch hell out every single time. There's actually literally nothing funny about that. So that's what I'm talking about, where I say these things and people have that nervous titter, but after having people go, well, you're a black person, so you got to go be an orc or like a half orc or something, or a big dumb brute, it's going to get real old real quick. And yes, I'm going to be that grumpy person.
Actually, with the orc thing, actually, a friend of mine, James Mendez-Hodes, did a really good dive into orcs were originally coded as Asian. And over the years, they've been coded as black, but they were originally coded as Asian. And the invading Hun coming into to the system.
But either way, orcs ain't white.
Orcs are brown people, either way. Yeah, it's a really good article. Go to his website to read it. So.
And so before we open for questions, this is the one thing I'm gonna read it to you since we don't have a screen, and I'll also tweet out this one slide. But the last thing that we always get is, well, how can I support people in this space, people of color? Because people will ask you, and it's like, well, I don't have money, or I don't have this, I don't have that, or I cannot find brown people. Look, there's a whole 5 of us right here, right now.
We're it though, it's just the 5 of us.
No more.
You're not helping, Graeme. I know where to find you later. In this room again. But this is the one thing I'm gonna read to you, either take notes or someone remind me to tweet this later, because I have a panel right after this and hopefully I'll remember to tweet it. But Google exists. And I'm not being facetious, try it. We all have the same Google. DC and I joked about that earlier, because people were like, I tried, I searched, I can't find anyone. And I'm like, did you get the special edition of Google that I can't access as a brown person? I'm sorry. And then after you finally find us and you complete this epic quest, don't ask us for emotional labor to fix your racist bullshit. Because I can't tell you how many DMs I get, how many emails I get, and not for like a legit, please spend your time and energy and I will pay you. This is the, oh my God, I saw this terrible thing, aren't you mad about it? Or this game is terrible, why aren't you tweeting about it? And why aren't you mad about it? Or hey, I wanted to have more brown people, and you probably are the only one I know. Can you be on my 5-hour show for no pay for like 10 weeks on East Coast time or Pacific time?
That goes for snitch tagging too.
What?
Snitch tagging?
Tagging.
Oh, so do people know what snitch tagging is?
Okay, so if someone posts something, usually on Twitter, that you find offensive, and your first reaction is to retweet it and at someone like Tanya or me or whomever else that you know might be offended by it because it affects the group that we're part of, without any context, as if to say, hey, you need to go yell at this person. That's snitch tagging.
And people will do
Don't
that.
do that.
They want entertainment trauma. They want us to go be attack dogs. I'm just going to say this, and this has nothing to do with me being kind or nice or the business. Tanya has stepped out of the room. Code switching is off. If you do that shit to me, I will find you and eviscerate you verbally on the internet, because none of us are your attack dogs, but black women get it so much worse. And then people sit back with their popcorn and they smile and they laugh when we go out and get these people with no context. And then we're the terrible, vicious, evil women, and we're the bitches who are picking on these poor, helpless white people who just don't know any better. So if you want to be the white person that goes and educates your fellow white people, go do that work and leave us out of it. But if you do actually want to learn, and I mean really learn, and not just be mad when I say generic white people on the internet, then go actually do the work. Listen to us and stop expecting us to do free emotional labor. And actually support us to make us feel welcome at the table. Don't give lip service. Don't wear ally everything and then go, but I'm a nice white person, I'm not racist. By dint of living in this country, for those of you that do live in this country and grew up here, you are indoctrinated into racist colonialist ideas from day one. Now, how you undo that, that's your own work, but you cannot sit there and go, well, I'm not racist and I don't have racist ideas, because you do, you just don't realize it. And lastly, if you have it, put your money where your mouth is. Because at the end of the day, all this is work. And some of us do this professionally, some of us do this as the main way we earn our money. And the work has value, especially if you really want to do the work and learn. And the last thing, because this happened to me at Gen Con 2 years running, do not ask us for permission to do racist shit in your games at your table. Because people always want basically an easy out, go, well, I was at a panel and Tanya said I could do this. No, don't do it. Don't do it, because I will find out somehow, because people talk. So that is the last thing I will say before we open for Q&A. We have 13 minutes, and for the benefit, since we are being recorded, one of us will repeat the question, so please have a question. It starts with a Q, not literally a Q, but it should be an interrogative. And if you're too afraid to open your mouth here, then you can tweet at me, and I may or may not answer you. I don't know. In the back, yes. And then I'll get you, Kiva.
How do you talked a lot about fantasy worlds where these things are created. How do you recommend addressing issues in games that are set in the contemporary world where all of these issues are really there? Because avoiding them feels wrong.
So something like the Dresden Files?
Or any of the any secret history game set in the modern world where it's the modern world plus whatever, or even just a straight out, modern world game.
So for the benefit of the recording, how do you deal with this in a game set in a modern world where racism is actually a thing, and what do you do with that? Because avoiding it in a contemporary setting would seem weird.
Don't lean into it. Like, that's the first big thing that I would say, is that don't lean into it. Yes, it exists. Yes, it can be an aspect of the game, depending on where you are in the world and what's going on there. But there's no reason to lean into it. There's no reason to center it. And above all else, there's no reason to weaponize it to use against your players. Because nothing kills a game faster than your players just getting sick of being abused in-game the same way they are in real life, for the purposes of entertainment for, at that point, other people.
Also, don't excuse it. This is not the fault of vampires. This is not the fault of werewolves. This is not the fault of whatever it is that you've decided is your other thing that is going on in the supernatural world. People are just horrible. And you can't just give the out for the onus of the origin of the problem and hand wave it off to the other creature.
And as Brian said earlier, recognize these things are systemic. Like, it's not an aspect of that one evil person or a character flaw in the individual. It's a cultural practice. And that if you break it down, like, oh, well, everyone in this town actually wasn't racist. They're just acting that way because the main guy in charge was racist. That you're not doing yourself or the game any favors at that point.
Also, realize the times where you're not equipped, just don't play. If it's like, oh, this looks like it's a lot, this is outside of my depth, and you're not sure how to fix it, don't play. Play another game. There are hundreds.
Kiva?
So in the original request, there was this black-coated species, erudites, and they were all super smart. And that feels just as bad to me, but I can't really articulate why.
Where's your question, Kiva?
The question is it just as bad and why to have black-coated characters being super smart or super competent, more so than everyone else in the set?
No, because we never see it. I didn't play EverQuest, so I never got to see that. I would kill to have an exceptionally amazing black character, and again, it's not the model minority, but that's me. I don't know what other people think.
Well, for me, I find that determinism of any kind is bad. And when you elevate any one group, you're necessarily leaving behind everyone else. So just because you've elevated black people means you've left behind Asian people, you left behind non-African descended Latinx people. There are lots of other people that are suddenly not as smart because they're not part of the in-group. That's not to say that it's inherently bad, it's to say that it's the determinism part that's bad. Not the, oh, well, there's a black person that's smarter than white people. Because, yeah, there are black people that are smarter than white people. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the problem comes from making the monolith coming from anything that, like I said, determinism, that you're born this way, therefore you are monolithically this. Whether that this is a good thing or a bad thing, it's still something that you have no control over makes you different.
People should be able to be any type of person that they want to be.
Especially in their make-believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Extra there.
Yeah.
Anyone else? We've got about 8 minutes. Way in the back.
Yeah, sorry. So one thing that I've been trying to make a concerted effort to learn and all that. When I was young, I really liked
Okay, you know what's coming next. Where's your question?
World of Warcraft. And looking back on that, you have certain races that are coded that, like, you have visual coding, but not as much in a, like, culture or anything, but it still feels gross, like it's cultural.
All right, so
how do we deal with that? How do we avoid that? And how do you call that out without, people claiming that you're trying to be a white savior?
So, I mean, I don't play Warcraft, so I'm not, all I know about Warcraft is I lose my friends every time there's an expansion.
There's a very distinctly,
All right, we got the question. So basically the question is, when you see things like, I guess, things in Warcraft that are very distinctly coded, how do you call it out without being called a white knight or speaking over people?
To be honest, you really can't. If you're going to call it out, there are people in the community that are going to go after you and accuse you of white knighting or doing any number of other things because you're pointing it out. It is a problem. I know what you're talking about because I had World of Warcraft inflicted on me several times. Did not get into it, but it's something that happens in fantasy and science fiction and other genres as well, and that's where cultural coding is done visually, but not necessarily through like how they speak or act or anything else like that, and it can be just as problematic. When you encounter it, call it out. Don't stop calling it out, but to be perfectly honest, there's no way that you're going to be able to do it without somebody reacting negatively to it. That's just one of those things you're going to have to weather, like the rest of us, in order to affect change.
Well,
And
and
pretty much
also,
anybody who uses dog whistles like white knighting, and why are you listening to their opinion anyway?
yeah, but also see if other people of color, other people that are already affected by that are speaking about it, and just retweet them. Don't talk over them. For those that don't know what white knighting is, that, let's say, I don't know your name, I'm sorry. But let's say I'm tweeting about something and you see me tweeting about it, and instead of just retweeting what I've said and going about your day, you go on this rant about, oh my God, this is so terrible, and how could Warcraft do this, and doesn't Blizzard know that this is so super racist, thereby obliterating what I've actually said, but you are so on your high horse, and you want people to look at you and go, look, and you're not literally doing this, but you're saying, look at this is terrible. So you can highlight what people are saying without speaking over them or for them, because I am very loud on the internet. I can talk for myself, and this is just using myself as an example without putting anyone else on the spot. But or if you really feel strong and you feel like you need to say something, check in and go, hey, I want to make sure I'm not speaking over anyone. I have feelings about it, but I also know that I'm a white dude, what have you. Are other people talking about that I can just share from versus getting on a soapbox and going on about it? Because I tune those people out and I'm like, okay, cool, you're mad. I have other things to go do.
Also, when you get called stuff like a white knight, stuff like that, just take the hit, because we're getting called stuff way worse, and we're not even playing the game because of stuff like that. So it's like, that's a part of the job when you're defending marginalized people, is you take the hits. And just like anyone else with any other kind of fight, if you can't take it, you go rest. You come back when you can.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes left. Yes, Liz.
Is colonialism another form of racism?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, let's repeat
I was like, how to answer that without being a smart
For the
ass?
recording.
for the recording, the question was, is colonialism another form of racism?
Yes.
And yes.
I think it's a universal yes. That
5
is.
out of 5 panelists say.
It is a 5 out of 5.
Yes.
Yes, and you'll be our last question.
So, could you give us some examples of games that you like that are good at doing all the things that you've been talking about today?
So the question is, can we give examples of games that are good at doing the things we talked about, like having racism, et cetera? I know Misha gave 2 examples at the beginning, if you don't mind re-giving them.
So the 2 examples I gave, one is Steal Away Jordan by Julia Ellingboe, Lellingboe. And Rosenstrasse, Rossenstrasse, by Mo Turkington and Jessica Hammer. Rosenstrasse is a LARP as opposed to a tabletop. Steal Away Jordan is tabletop. Another excellent example is Companion's Tale by Laura Simpson. It is you're playing the companions of a great hero. You're never really talking about the hero themselves. You're talking about what the companions experienced as you were doing it. It's a beautifully written game. It's fun to play. It's usually themed for one-shots. So those are 3 examples of games that I enjoy.
Anybody else?
I wish. I really do. I wish I had. I am primarily a tabletop role-playing game player, and because I those are the games I like the most, and those are the games when I have time to play, I gravitate to those games, and unfortunately, those games bear the legacy of Tolkien and Gygax and the determinism that they brought to fantasy. Well, actually, I'm at a panel on that tomorrow, workshop on that tomorrow. But we're still many years away, I think, of work to cleanse the space of that legacy. I know that there are games that are going to be coming out soon that I think are making attempts at that, but they're not in my hands yet, and so I can't tell you that they're there. My hope, the work that I do is in the hopes of making the existing games better the games that I play, rather than trying to bring something brand new to the table. But that's me, you know, that's everybody likes a different flavor of ice cream.
Play my game. It's called Mutants in the Night. It's about all of this. It is a game about marginalization that very safely puts you in a position where you can experience marginalization on a lot of different axes, including your own, and you'll get a little bit of taste of other people's without walking around in somebody else's skin. You can find it online, just type in Mutants in the Night, or you can just pirate it from somebody.
Yep. And with that, we are at time. Thank you all so much for hanging out. We have a 15-minute break before the next panel, which is Queer as a Three-Sided Die. I'm also on that panel. We get to talk about being really queer in games, so come and hang out.